Let's walk back, tens of thousands of years, to a time when the world was colder, quieter, and the nights were longer than anything you or I have ever known. We're stepping into the Ice Age, not as tourists, but as quiet observers, trying to understand how, in the most hostile, freezing environments, our ancient ancestors managed not only to survive, but to sleep deep. Before we settle into tonight's long journey back through time, I just want to thank you for being here, wherever in the world you are. I'd love to know what time is it for you right now, and where are you listening from? Drop a comment down below, and if you enjoy this kind of quiet exploration, it really helps to like the video and subscribe. We make these long-form prehistoric deep dives just for you, to help you relax, sleep, or drift into another world. Alright, close your eyes if you'd like. It might sound surprising, but there's growing evidence that prehistoric people, even during the dead of winter, may have had better rest than many of us today. Not because they had warm beds or heated homes, far from it, but because their lives followed rhythms more aligned with the earth. They weren't drowning in blue light or buzzing alarms. They weren't drinking caffeine to power through late nights. Their days were dictated by firelight and the movement of the sun across the sky. And when the sun disappeared, when winter's cold gripped the land and snow blanketed the earth, they adjusted, not with panic, but with preparation, with instinct, with knowledge passed through stories and rituals, slowly over generations. We'll explore how they did it, how caves, fire, community, biology, and even the shape of the land gave them the tools they needed to sleep soundly when the world outside was ice and wind. Let's start with the basics, where they slept. When we imagine prehistoric people, we picture caves, and that's not entirely wrong. Caves offered critical shelter from the elements, but not all caves were created equal. Some were too damp, others too exposed to wind. What many people don't realize is that the best suited caves for winter sleep were ones with a narrow entrance, often facing away from prevailing winds, and deep inner chambers where temperatures stayed relatively stable, sometimes between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures dropped well below freezing. That may not sound cozy, but when you've wrapped yourself in the hides of mammoth or bison, when your body has adapted to the cold over months, and when a fire crackles nearby, it creates a space that's not only survivable, it's safe. A womb-like pocket in the heart of stone, where night after night, families curled together in a communal sleep. Fire changed everything. It didn't just keep them warm, it transformed how they felt about the night. Fire was a source of light, yes, but more importantly, it was a symbol of security. Wild animals feared it. It allowed people to cook, to craft tools, to tell stories after dark. But it also gave them warmth through the night. Many cave sites show soot marks and layers of ash that suggest fires were kept burning throughout long winter nights. Carefully tended, passed on from person to person, like a sacred duty. One person would stir the embers, another would lay new wood, and nearby others would sleep, curled in furs, pressed close together, body heat shared, infants swaddled and tucked near their mothers, old ones warmed by fire and family. That's how they made it through the cold. Not by fighting it, but by folding into it, by wrapping themselves in layers of warmth, both physical and emotional. Modern researchers have also begun to understand something fascinating about how early humans may have adapted their sleep cycles to the seasons. In today's world, we often ignore the change in daylight across seasons. Artificial light keeps us going year-round, but for Paleolithic people, darkness ruled the winter months. Days were short, nights were long. In response, it's possible that humans entered what some scientists call biphasic, or even polyphasic sleep. This means they may have slept in multiple segments, falling asleep after sundown, waking in the middle of the night for a period of calm wakefulness, sometimes called the watch, and then drifting off again until morning. During this midnight wakefulness, people may have talked, reflected, mended clothing, or tended the fire, and then, like animals nesting into their dens, they returned to sleep. Not rushed, not anxious, just in rhythm, like the trees, like the snow, like the stars that moved overhead, with slow ancient patience. But maybe the most surprising element of winter sleep is this. Our ancestors didn't sleep alone. This wasn't a world of separate rooms or solitary beds. Sleep was communal. That changes everything. Anthropologists studying cold-adapted cultures, like the Nenets of Siberia, or the Sami in northern Scandinavia, observe a powerful, shared warmth strategy. Sleep in groups, close and layered. The same likely held true tens of thousands of years ago. Families didn't just survive the night. They created rituals around it. The act of preparing for sleep was as sacred as waking. Skins were arranged. Firewood was stacked. Children were soothed by stories. Myths passed in whispers. Legends of animals, spirits, and ancestors. And slowly, the group would quiet, one by one, until only the crackle of the fire and the breath of sleep remained. Imagine it, not as a primitive experience, but as one full of softness, connection, and belonging. There's something beautifully clever about the way our ancestors approached the art of sleeping in cold weather. It was never just about lying down and closing their eyes. It was a process, a preparation. One of the earliest and most overlooked aspects of that preparation was the sleeping surface itself. Contrary to popular belief, early humans didn't just sleep on bare cave floors. Archaeological digs across Europe and parts of Africa have revealed layered bedding structures, compacted grasses, woven mats of reeds or rushes, even animal hides arranged atop soft insulating materials. In some places, people laid out piles of aromatic plants like yarrow or wild thyme, which weren't just comfortable, they repelled insects and carried calming scents. Over time, these layered beds would be refreshed, rebuilt, and maintained, forming compact, well-worn spots in the dirt or stone that acted as nests. These weren't accidental, they were crafted with care. In the Sibiru cave in South Africa, researchers uncovered what may be some of the earliest known bedding. Dating back nearly 77,000 years, the people who slept there used layers of sedge and other plants, interwoven and packed down, forming sleeping platforms up to a meter wide. Beneath those layers, they placed ash from past fires, which helped deter pests and added insulation. Imagine lying down on a mattress of fragrant herbs and fire-softened earth, with the low light of embers flickering nearby. It's not hard to see why. In many ways, prehistoric humans may have had a more grounded, healthier relationship with rest than we do today. These beds, humble as they seem, were part of a broader system, a small but vital piece of the survival puzzle that allowed humans to make the long winters not just bearable but restful. Of course, a bed is only as good as the warmth it can hold. That's where animal hides come in, thick furs from creatures like bison, aurochs, and mammoths. These hides weren't just thrown down haphazardly. They were softened, scraped, cured with smoke, and layered to create protective cocoons against the cold. The inside of a Paleolithic sleeping area could feel like a cave within a cave. Layers of hide around and over the body, forming what we might call a sleeping pod. These hide wraps trapped heat so efficiently that, paired with the shared warmth of a sleeping group, body temperature could be maintained even in near-freezing conditions. Small details mattered: where the head was positioned, how the smoke from the fire moved through the space, how embers were banked to radiate heat without sparking flames. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. There's a word used in modern survivalist circles: microclimate. Our ancestors were masters at creating them. Inside their dwellings, they built small zones of livable warmth, not by heating the whole space, but by containing their own warmth in smart, localized ways. Animal skins were sometimes arranged like tents within the cave, held up by mammoth bones or wooden poles. In rock shelters and tents made from reindeer hides, ventilation gaps were deliberately created to prevent smoke buildup, learning over generations how to strike the delicate balance between warmth and breathable air. Many sleeping areas were tucked into alcoves or corners where heat could be preserved and drafts avoided. Even the fire itself wasn't always in the center. Sometimes it was placed off to one side, so that smoke would drift upward and out through natural chimneys or carved vents. These weren't random choices. They were techniques refined through observation, intuition, and lived experience. But it wasn't just about warmth or comfort, it was also about safety. Nighttime in the Paleolithic world carried real danger. Predators like cave lions, hyenas, wolves, or even rival humans roamed the darkness. Sleep had to be protected. That's why fires weren't left untended, and sleeping spaces were often organized with care. Some groups may have taken turns standing watch, others trained themselves to wake at the slightest noise, a habit that still lingers in our DNA. One reason so many of us stir when a floor creaks or a branch snaps outside. But there's also evidence that many caves used for winter shelter were selected precisely because they offered natural protection. Narrow entrances, elevated ledges, echo chambers, where approaching animals would be heard long before they arrived. These weren't accidental choices. They were the product of a brain tuned for survival and for sleep. Even children played a role in this system. Among hunter-gatherer societies today, and likely in our distant past, children were often raised within communal sleeping environments, where the rhythms of adult life shaped their own. That constant closeness gave infants a steady source of warmth and regulation, while older children learned to observe and mimic adult behaviors, including fire tending and hide preparation. These weren't passive observers. They were active participants in the collective effort to make night survivable. And over time, this gave rise to cultural memory, a passing of knowledge, not through writing, but through doing. How to tuck a hide, to stop a draft, which plants smelled sweetest and lasted the longest, where the safest sleeping spot was in a given cave. These lessons were woven into nightly rituals, spoken and unspoken, and carried forward, not as chores, but as the fabric of life itself. As the winter months deepened, and the nights stretched longer, the boundaries between waking and sleeping began to blur. In the absence of clocks, schedules, and artificial light, time became something else entirely, something felt rather than measured. Many researchers believe that early humans, especially during the coldest seasons, slipped into patterns of extended rest that we might not even recognize today. Not sleep as we know it, a fixed 8-hour block, but something slower, gentler. It's possible that people would drift in and out of sleep over the course of 12 or even 14 hours, moving between light dreaming, wakefulness, and deeper stages of slumber. This kind of natural rhythm, sometimes referred to as segmented sleep, mirrors patterns observed in pre-electricity societies, and even in animals that live in polar environments. During the longest nights, people weren't simply asleep. They were existing in a kind of dreamy twilight, suspended between worlds, with no need to rush. And those dreams, they may have mattered more than we realize. In many indigenous cultures around the world, dreams are not mere illusions. They're messages, visions, even warnings. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Hadza of Tanzania or the Penan of Borneo, note that dreams are often treated as a form of knowledge, a way to understand the unseen. It's not hard to imagine that Paleolithic people felt the same. In winter, when movement slowed and danger loomed beyond the cave, the interior life, dreams, memories, intuition, became as important as the exterior one. Stories told by firelight were often shaped by dreams. A hunter might recount a vision of a reindeer herd seen in sleep, and the group would listen closely, not as entertainment, but as guidance. Dreaming wasn't idle, it was part of survival, and sleep was the doorway to it. We can also look to the body itself, how it physically adapted to the demands of winter rest. For one, cold temperatures promote deeper sleep. Modern sleep scientists have found that people tend to sleep more soundly in cooler environments, with temperatures around 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit being ideal for triggering melatonin release and sustaining REM sleep. Now imagine sleeping in a stone-walled shelter, wrapped in layers of hide, pressed against others for warmth, with the cold air softly numbing your skin. It was the perfect biological setting for long, slow, uninterrupted sleep. Add to that the reduced physical activity during winter, fewer hours for hunting, more time spent resting and conserving energy, and you have a body that is primed for deep restoration. The cold wasn't just endured, it was used. It carved out a kind of hibernation space for the human body, not unlike what we see in some animals that enter torpor during the harshest months. And it wasn't only about physiology, it was about trust. Trust in the group, trust in the fire, trust in the cave itself. Our ancestors knew that sleeping deeply in such an unforgiving world could be dangerous. You had to be sure someone was watching the fire, that your position in the group offered warmth and protection, that the walls around you wouldn't collapse or betray you, that the smells of smoke and soot, the feel of fur against skin, the breath of others, all meant safety. These layers of comfort, not individual but communal, created the conditions for rest. Imagine lying with your back against a mother or a brother, a child curled against your chest, the fire's orange glow flickering across the ceiling. Outside, wolves may have howled in the distance, the wind hissed through the trees, but inside, there was a stillness and a shared silence that allowed sleep to come. We see echoes of this in the art they left behind. In Chauvet, in Lascaux, in Altamira, those famous cave sites filled with paintings of animals and symbols. There's something curious. Many of these artworks are found deep in the cave systems, far from natural light, in places that would have been hard to reach. Why paint there? Some scholars believe that these chambers were used not just for rituals, but for sensory experiences connected to sleep, dreams, and altered states. The flickering torchlight, the shadows cast by the uneven stone, the acoustics of echoing chambers, all of it may have created dreamlike spaces where waking and sleeping consciousness blended. Perhaps people journeyed into those depths after waking from profound dreams. Perhaps they slept there deliberately, closer to the spirit world they believed lived in the walls. If sleep was a sacred act, then some caves may have been more than shelters. They were temples of the night. Even today, when we sleep outdoors, under the stars, near a fire, away from noise and light, something ancient stirs in us. A sense of quiet that feels older than memory. It's a return. And that's what our ancestors knew. Every winter, every time they lay down. Sleep wasn't an inconvenience. It wasn't something to fight or shorten. It was a gift, a way to reconnect with themselves, with each other, and with the rhythms of the world they lived in. A world where winter was not an enemy, but a teacher. And sleep, even in the darkest months, was not a risk, it was a refuge. In those long winter nights, the line between rest and ritual may have been thinner than we think. The act of preparing for sleep, arranging hides, banking the fire, securing the cave's entrance, wasn't just about comfort, it was ceremonial, passed down from elders to the young. These evening rituals were layered with meaning, a certain way of folding the skins. A quiet chant or rhythm hummed beneath the breath, maybe the placing of a carved stone near the head for protection, or a bundle of dried herbs near the fire to scent the air. These weren't random habits, they were encoded practices that helped shape the night into something more than darkness. They prepared the body for rest, yes, but also the spirit, and in doing so, they brought a sense of calm that ran deeper than safety. It bordered on peace. Much of this knowledge likely lived in the hands of women. Across many hunter-gatherer societies studied today, it's the women who maintain the sleeping spaces, tend to children, and organize the rhythm of domestic life. They knew how to dry hides without stiffening them, how to weave rushes into soft pads, how to create smoke from particular woods that would lull infants into sleep without choking the air. Imagine the layers of understanding needed to transform the raw materials of the Ice Age world into something nurturing. A mammoth hide isn't soft until it's worked for days. A bed of reeds needs to be dried just right to avoid mold in the damp of the cave. And certain herbs, when burned or scattered, calm the nervous system. These weren't guesses. They were skills carried across generations, embedded in daily action, and guarded as part of the group's survival. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as endlessly chaotic. Danger, cold, hunger. And yes, those things were real. But so were the pockets of calm, and moments of rhythm. Sleep was one of the few times when all movement slowed. When you lay still, heart steady, listening to the slow breathing of those around you. In that space, the world narrowed down to warmth and darkness, to the fading crackle of the last log, to the soft brush of fur against skin. No walls, no clocks, no distant highways, just the hush of stone and fire. Researchers now believe that this depth of silence may have influenced not just sleep quality, but brain development. Long, uninterrupted sleep supports memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and immune response. In fact, some studies suggest that we are biologically wired to sleep better in natural darkness and cooler temperatures, the very conditions our ancestors knew intimately. And then there was the role of food. What we eat before bed influences how well we sleep. A truth as old as the human body. During the Ice Age winters, meals were designed not just to nourish, but to sustain warmth through the night. High-fat, high-protein diets from meat and marrow gave people the long-lasting energy to maintain body heat. Bone broths, simmered over fires, releasing collagen and nutrients. Rendered fat might be mixed with dried berries or nuts to create a dense food source, something close to what modern survivalists call pemmican. Eating before rest wasn't indulgence, it was strategy. A warm belly meant a warm core, and when paired with the communal heat of shared sleep, it created a system in which even the coldest nights could be endured with surprising ease. Another curious insight comes from studying cave positioning itself. Many of the sites known to have been winter shelters weren't just randomly chosen. They were aligned with the path of the winter sun. In southern-facing rock shelters, the first light of day would seep into the cave at a shallow angle, warming the space gently after the coldest part of the night. Over time, people may have learned to choose dwellings that gave them this advantage: natural heating from the low arc of the sun. This kind of passive solar design wasn't something they read in a manual. It was learned through observation, season after season. And it mattered. A few degrees of warmth could mean the difference between survival and frostbite, between a restless night and a full return to deep body-repairing sleep. And through all of this, there was the ever-present rhythm of sound. Not just speech or song, but the ambient noise of the prehistoric night. Wind rushing through pines, ice cracking on frozen rivers, the snort of reindeer in the distance, the hush of snow against stone. These sounds were familiar, even comforting. They were signals that all was as it should be. Anthropologists call this acoustic ecology. The idea that soundscapes shape how we feel, think, and rest. And in the deep winters of the Paleolithic world, those soundscapes were slow, low, and natural. No mechanical interruptions, no electric buzz, just the low murmur of fire and breath. It was a lullaby, not sung, but lived. Even the position of the body during sleep had significance. Anthropological research and ethnographic studies show that traditional human groups often slept in fetal positions during cold months, knees tucked in, arms drawn close, not only for warmth, but for energy conservation. This position minimizes the surface area exposed to cold air, and naturally protects vital organs. When you lie like that, especially in contact with another person, it creates a micro-environment of heat and stillness. Over time, groups may have developed patterns. Who slept where, in what order, how children were placed between parents or elders. Not randomly, but based on who needed the most warmth, who was healthiest, who was keeping watch. In this silent choreography, people became insulation for one another, a living weave of breath and heartbeat and skin. Even their breathing may have adjusted. In colder climates, humans instinctively slow their breathing to conserve heat and moisture. This is still seen in high-altitude or polar-dwelling populations. During sleep, especially, the breath becomes shallow and steady, the chest rising in rhythm with the fire's soft crackle. Imagine lying in the quiet cave, the air just above freezing, the smell of ash and earth around you. No words spoken, only the slow inhale of your sleeping group, the same rhythm, night after night. It was in that rhythm that trust was built, that security was felt. Long before houses or locks or alarms, There was only this: warmth, closeness, and quiet lungs at rest. In this way, the very concept of sleep wasn't individualized the way it is now. It was shared. There were no personal bedrooms or isolated routines. Instead, sleep was woven into the collective rhythm of the group. When one person stirred to stoke the fire, another rolled closer to the warmth. When an infant fussed, the group didn't rouse in irritation. They responded in unison, soothing, adjusting, waiting. This kind of communal sleeping has been observed in modern nomadic groups, such as the Juhono of the Kalahari, where sleep isn't just a biological act, but a social one. It's a fluid, adaptive process. People waking briefly, checking on one another, then returning to slumber. What we call interrupted sleep, they might have called normal, a natural flow, not a disruption. It changes how we think of rest, not as isolation, but as connection. And of course, winter wasn't only endured, it was anticipated. For months before the cold arrived, groups prepared. They collected materials not just for food and weapons, but for comfort. Dry grass for bedding, bark and resin for insulation, animal sinew to sew tighter seams in their clothing and furs. Sometimes they built windbreaks within caves, or carved shallow depressions in the ground to nestle into at night. These weren't improvisations, they were preparations, tested over seasons and shared through generations. People remembered which places got morning light, which caves echoed with dangerous drafts, which valleys funneled ice-laced winds. Their sleep in winter wasn't luck. It was the result of months of careful planning and adaptation, and of deep memory, not written, but remembered by the body, and passed along in gesture and word. The brain, too, played its part. With the absence of artificial light, human melatonin cycles, the chemical signals that control sleepiness, were tightly in sync with natural darkness. In winter, as the sun set early and didn't rise until late, melatonin flowed longer in the body, triggering longer rest. Sleep researchers have found that people deprived of artificial light naturally drift into longer sleep cycles over time, particularly during colder months. So in a Paleolithic winter, the body was chemically primed for sleep. No supplements, no tricks, just biology reacting to the real world. The long nights invited slowness, and the body accepted. That's perhaps one of the most striking things, how ready the human animal was to live in harmony with winter, not as an enemy to overcome, but as a rhythm to move within. All of this gives us a picture that is the opposite of what we're taught to imagine. Cavemen shivering, wide-eyed in fear, huddled and restless. That's the myth, but the reality may be far more elegant. A deeply intelligent adaptation to the hardest season. Rest crafted not in spite of the cold, but with it. Sleep that was communal, cyclical, and respected. And when we look closely at the evidence, the bedding sites, the soot patterns, the hide remnants, the cave layouts, the biological clues, what we see is not desperation, we see design. We see restfulness, born of ritual and environment. And we begin to ask, in our modern world of noise and light and isolation, have we forgotten something our ancestors knew by heart? To truly understand how cavemen slept in the frozen dark, we have to go beyond physical, beyond the hides and the fire in the stone walls. We have to consider emotion, connection, the profound psychological safety that came from being surrounded by people you trusted with your life. This wasn't just a warm body beside you. It was your kin, your clan, your protection. That safety wasn't abstract. It was tactile, lived and nightly reaffirmed. The soothing sound of a parent's voice, the scratch of a sibling shifting in their sleep, the ever-present warmth of others pressing close. These cues regulated the nervous system, calming the brain into deep restorative rest. Neuroscience today tells us that co-sleeping, when done safely, can reduce stress hormones and synchronize heartbeats. Imagine that kind of synchronization every night with the same people for years on end. Sleep became more than restoration. It became bonding. Even the very act of sleep may have had spiritual meaning. Many ancient cultures, including those in later prehistory, and even into early written history, viewed sleep as a journey, a temporary death, a walk through another world. The line between dream and vision was not sharp. The long winter nights offered an extended passage into that other world, where ancestors might appear, messages might be received, or lessons learned. There is archaeological evidence, carved figurines, ochre markings, intentionally placed bones, that suggests nighttime rituals took place, especially during solstices or deep winter months. These rituals weren't just about the living. They connected the living to those who had come before, and when one lay down to sleep after such a ceremony, wrapped in the scent of smoke and the murmur of chanting, it wasn't just rest, it was a passage into something greater, something layered with reverence. The environment shaped every part of this. In Ice Age Europe and parts of northern Asia, the cold was relentless, but it was not always uniform. Some nights were clear and dry, others heavy with snow. Caves and shelters adapted accordingly. In sites like Dolní Věstonice, in present-day Czechia, excavations show semi-permanent winter dwellings made of mammoth bones and earth, arranged in circles with hearths in the center. These weren't temporary hides thrown together. They were thoughtful constructions, designed to withstand brutal cold while holding warmth. The sleeping areas were deliberately positioned along the inner ring, closest to the fire, but shielded from smoke. Entryways were sometimes blocked with hides or stones to keep out wind. These structures, some 25,000 years old, reflect a deep knowledge of airflow, heat retention, and space use. Architecture built with survival in mind, but also rest. And then there's light. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was the night's only light. A flicker of flames shaped how people fell asleep, how they dreamed. In fact, recent studies show that firelight, unlike blue light from screens, doesn't disrupt circadian rhythms. Quite the opposite, it mimics the slow decline of sunset and lulls the body into releasing melatonin naturally. Paleolithic people didn't need sleep hygiene tips or blackout curtains. They had a built-in system: firelight, followed by darkness. Even the act of tending the fire had a rhythm to it, one that soothed and signaled. When the fire burned low, it told the body, time to sleep. And so sleep came, again and again, gently coaxed by the elemental language of flame and shadow. There are signs, too, that the winter months may have been a time not just of longer sleep, but of intentional slowing down. This wasn't a season for productivity. It was a season for preservation. Food was conserved. Movements were minimal. Days were quiet. And so the body had room to restore itself. Cold naturally reduces inflammation. Slower schedules reduce physical strain. Modern life fights against this rhythm, pushing us to maintain the same pace all year long. But the ancient world didn't. It listened, and in the listening, it slept more deeply than we can easily imagine today. Perhaps the most powerful thing we can learn from all this is that prehistoric sleep wasn't something to conquer. It was something to respect, to shape with care. They didn't see sleep as a weakness or an inconvenience. It was survival, spirituality, medicine, and memory. It was shared, protected, and ritualized. And it reminds us that rest, true rest, is something we once knew intimately. We didn't need apps or trackers. We needed darkness, closeness, warmth, and silence, and those things, despite all our advancements, remain as essential today as they were under the mammoth hide shelters in fire-warmed caves of the Ice Age. If you try to imagine the air inside one of those winter shelters, the first thing that strikes you is probably the scent. Not something sterile or clean, but layered. The musky depth of cured hides, the mineral dust of stone, the dry bitterness of ash, the sweet drift of crushed herbs scattered on the floor. A smoke, but not suffocating. Just enough to sting the eyes slightly, reminding you the fire was still alive. All of this mattered. These scents weren't random background. They formed part of the landscape of sleep. Just like a familiar smell can calm a modern baby, the consistent scent profile of a winter dwelling signaled safety and home. Over time, the brain associated these smells with rest. And every night, when those smells deepened as fire smoldered and the air cooled, the body responded, muscles softening, breath slowing, In the absence of words or clocks, smell told you when to sleep. Sound played just as vital a role. Unlike modern life, where we often need white noise to block out jarring interruptions, the prehistoric night was already full of subtle rhythmic soundscapes. The occasional hiss of wind over rock, the shifting groan of snow sliding from an overhang, the crackling of embers as wood popped inside. Inside the shelter, the human sounds were subdued. Muffled movements, the soft scuff of fur, the cough of someone waking briefly and settling again. These weren't disturbances. They were part of the rhythm, woven into the lullaby of the night. Today, researchers studying sleep environments emphasize the importance of consistent low-frequency sound. It helps the brain stay in deep sleep cycles. Our ancestors didn't invent sound machines. They lived in them, surrounded by organic noise that supported their rest. We don't often think about temperature gradients, but our ancestors did. Even if not consciously, they understood, through repeated experience, where warmth pooled and where it escaped. In a cave or hide dwelling, heat rises, so raised platforms made from branches and earth may have been used to elevate bedding off the cold ground. In some regions, sleeping pits were dug into the soil, lined with layers of insulating material. These pits didn't just hold bodies, they held heat, forming pockets of retained warmth that could last for hours. Even the way people positioned themselves, backs toward the fire, feet closer to others, showed a subtle intelligence about heat conservation. Modern thermal imaging studies on traditional shelters confirm what prehistoric people likely knew by instinct, that shared body heat, proper airflow, and thoughtful placement make a dramatic difference in thermal retention. Even with no external insulation, touch too was part of sleep. Not as an accident, but as a necessary element. In the cold, the human nervous system responds most acutely to skin-to-skin contact. Infants regulate temperature and stress through physical closeness. Elders rest more easily when surrounded by familiar warmth. We now know that oxytocin, the bonding hormone, is released through gentle, sustained contact. In those sleeping bundles beneath furs, as people breathed together and shifted in unconscious synchrony, oxytocin may have flowed freely, reinforcing social bonds night after night. These chemicals of connection made the group stronger, more cohesive. It wasn't just emotional support, it was neurochemical reinforcement. Sleep was literally stitching the community together while they lay in the dark. And if you look beyond the cave, out into the snow-covered world, you'll see another secret to their success. Silence. True, unbroken silence. Not the quiet of a room, but the absolute stillness of a frozen forest or an icy plain. A kind of hush that presses against your ears. In those conditions, even the smallest noise, the rustle of a bird, the crack of an ice shelf, sounds immense. That contrast shaped the nervous system differently. In the shelter of silence, the brain doesn't stay hypervigilant. It learns to let go, to settle. Modern studies show that exposure to natural silence, especially in wintry landscapes, lowers cortisol and eases heart rate variability. It was in that deep, frozen hush that prehistoric humans laid down each night, and it was within that silence that they recovered, both physically and mentally, for the days ahead. In every detail, from smell to sound to touch to space. Their world was not primitive, but refined in ways we've largely forgotten, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they paid attention. They lived close to the world, not buffered from it, and in doing so, they learned to rest the way their bodies asked them to. Slowly, collectively, deeply. Winter sleep was not a challenge to be endured. It was an environment to be shaped, a season of stillness that they entered with intention. In that, there's something for us to remember. That rest doesn't come from controlling every variable, but from knowing which ones to let go of, and which ones to shape with care. The farther we trace back into the cold shadow of deep time, the more we begin to see a kind of quiet genius in the way early humans aligned themselves with winter. They weren't simply reacting to the cold, they were planning for it, partnering with it. Just as birds sense when to migrate, or bears prepare to hibernate, Our ancestors moved with the signals of the season. As autumn leaves began to curl and fall, as daylight shrank and food began to change, so did they. Their pace slowed, their attention shifted inward. Sleep became longer, more sacred, more central. In a sense, winter transformed the body's entire orientation toward rest. And this was not seen as weakness or retreat. It was nature's order, followed without resistance. They didn't push against it, they leaned in. Even today, faint echoes of this remain in our biology. Many people experience changes in energy and sleep patterns as winter approaches. A pull toward stillness, a craving for warmth, a softening of outward focus. These aren't flaws. They're evolutionary remnants of a time when slowing down wasn't just allowed, it was essential. For early humans, winter was not a season of performance. It was a season of preservation. It wasn't about forging ahead, it was about staying close to fire, to family, to stillness. And sleep was the anchor that held it all together. A time when the mind repaired, when the body slowed, and when the soul, if we can call it that, found safety in the dark. Much of this was made possible by one powerful force, predictability. In a world that was often dangerous and unstable, the rhythms of winter sleep offered consistency. The same firelight, the same smells, the same familiar shapes in the stone. The way someone always turned once in their sleep at a certain hour. The way the fire crackled just before going quiet. These subtle nightly repetitions became emotional landmarks, like lullabies of routine. In modern terms, we might call it sleep hygiene. A structured bedtime, a stable environment, the right cues. But in that ancient context, it was lived, not prescribed. And that predictability gave the nervous system permission to truly relax, because every night followed a pattern that said, you are safe here, you are home. And when illness came, as it surely did, in a time before medicine or antibiotics, sleep became even more vital. The body's only real defense against infection was to rest, to conserve. And so the group adapted. A sick member might be swaddled tighter, placed closer to the fire, given extra warmth and food. Others would adjust their sleep to accommodate them, waking more often to check on their breath, listening in the dark for signs of change. Even in the Ice Age, the response to illness was not fear but care. Rest wasn't abandoned in times of trouble. It was increased, prioritized. They may not have understood pathogens, but they understood the body's need to shut down and rebuild in quiet, and sleep was where that rebuilding happened. The seasonal cycles also shaped how memory was processed. Longer periods of rest, more dreams, more time for reflection. All of this meant that winter wasn't just a physical shift, but a mental one. With less movement and more stillness, stories gained space, memories surfaced. Wisdom passed down from elders could be shared around the fire in longer, slower patterns. Children weren't just told what to do, they were told why. In the language of dreams and myths, people made sense of their place in the world. And that act of telling and listening and dreaming strengthened not just understanding, but sleep itself. Because to sleep well is not only about warmth and darkness, it's also about what lives in your mind when you close your eyes. And so winter, in the prehistoric world, wasn't a blank stretch of cold waiting to be survived. It was an intentional, deeply sensory, psychologically rich experience of rest. It was marked by structure, but softened by care. Every night brought a familiar ritual. Every morning, a slow awakening. The snow may have been deep outside, the predators real, the hunger close. But inside those shelters, under the soft rustle of hides, a different world existed. One where the body surrendered to the dark, not in fear, but in rhythm. A world where sleep wasn't taken for granted. It was prepared for, protected, honored. And in that honoring, they built not just resilience, but restoration. One of the most fascinating clues we have about ancient winter sleep doesn't come from fossils or stone tools. It comes from the lingering biology in our own bodies. There's a hypothesis among some researchers that during the harshest parts of the Ice Age, humans may have undergone brief periods of torpor, a kind of mini hibernation, not the deep months-long slumber of a bear, but a slowed-down metabolic state where body temperature dropped slightly, energy use decreased, and movement was minimal. Though this idea remains debated, it's supported by indirect evidence: thickened bones in some Ice Age skeletons, deposits of growth rings in long bones suggesting periods of halted activity, and even genetic markers in modern humans tied to fat storage and energy conservation. Whether or not full torpor was ever achieved, what's clear is this: our ancestors were remarkably efficient at conserving energy during the deepest winter, and sleep was their primary tool. To see echoes of this lifestyle today, anthropologists look at groups still living traditional, non-industrial lives in challenging environments. The Hadza of East Africa, for instance, or the Inuit and Sami in northern regions. These communities provide invaluable insight into how sleep functions in societies without electric lights, rigid clocks, or temperature control. In these groups, sleep is flexible, but always grounded in the rhythm of light and community. People nap when tired, wake easily, and often gather around firelight in the evening to talk or do quiet tasks. A mirror of how early humans may have prepared for sleep. What's striking is that despite the lack of strict sleep schedules, their rest tends to be deep and restorative. No struggle with insomnia, no blue light disruption, no separation from their environment. Their lives and their sleep are integrated. And integration was the key. In the prehistoric winter world, sleep wasn't a bubble isolated from the rest of life. It was a thread woven through every part of the day. The decisions people made while awake: where to build the fire, how to angle the shelter, when to eat, who to lie beside, all influenced how well they'd sleep that night. There wasn't a bedtime so much as a winding down of the entire group. As the sun sank and the sky grew heavy with night, the pace of everything changed. Voices dropped, movements slowed. The whole group entered sleep gradually, like a tide receding, and within that collective rhythm, no one was left behind. The elderly, the young, the sick, all shared in the same slow passage into rest, wrapped in the same communal warmth. In many cases, sleep was not something done all at once. The concept of sleeping through the entire night in one solid block is more modern than we often realize. Evidence from pre-industrial societies and historical records from medieval Europe suggest that segmented sleep was once the norm. People would sleep for a few hours, wake naturally in the middle of the night for quiet reflection or small tasks, then return to sleep until dawn. In a Paleolithic winter, this pattern may have been particularly common. The first sleep would begin soon after dusk. A midnight wakeful period, perhaps an hour or two, would follow, used for tending fire, whispering, perhaps even stargazing, just outside the cave. And then, a second sleep would take hold. This rhythm allowed for both safety and adaptation, giving the group multiple chances to adjust, respond, and drift back into the comfort of layered slumber. It's also worth considering how temperature worked, not just as an obstacle, but as a signal. As the fire died down in the early morning hours, the ambient cold deepened. This likely triggered subtle shifts in the sleeping group. People turned inward, curled tighter, covered exposed skin. It may even have been a natural cue for someone to wake and feed the fire again. An act done almost without thought. That responsiveness to cold, not as threat but as messenger, shaped the night's rhythm. Unlike us, fumbling with thermostats or electric blankets, they listened to the cold. They moved with it. And the cold, in turn, instructed them when to rise, when to gather closer, when to let sleep deepen. Their rest wasn't stolen from the cold, it was taught by it. In this way, we begin to see a picture of winter sleep, not as a simple act, but as a dance between light and dark, heat and cold, solitude and connection. A balance of body and world, continually negotiated and refined. What seems harsh to us now, sleeping in a stone cave in freezing temperatures, was to them a canvas of learned responses, layered wisdom, and communal instinct. They didn't sleep despite the season. They slept with it, inside it. And that cooperation with nature is perhaps the deepest secret of all. one that still sleeps in our DNA, waiting for us to remember. As winter held the land in its frozen grasp, the cave, or tent, or earthen hut, became more than a shelter. It became a container for memory. The walls that kept out the cold also held the voices of the past. Each night, as the fire dimmed and bodies folded into warmth, stories were spoken into the dark. These stories weren't random. They were carefully chosen, repeated, and passed down like tools. They often carried warnings about frost, about predators, about what not to do when the wind shifts. But they also held rituals, specific instructions, how to place your sleeping fur so it won't slip, how to stack kindling to burn slow through the night, how to lie down so the ache in your back doesn't deepen. These weren't bedtime tales in the way we think of them now. They were coded survival, hidden in rhythm and voice, passed from elders to children in the time just before sleep. The memory of winter was something people carried in their bodies. Children, watching closely, learned not by instruction but by mimicry. They watched how their mothers laid out bedding, how their fathers stirred embers with a flat stone to avoid sparks. They saw how older siblings adjusted the hides to shield the fire from wind, how grandparents used soft humming to lull the little ones. These were quiet teachings. They didn't need explanation. In the long darkness, there was time to observe, not just how people acted, but how they rested. And those patterns became part of a child. In that way, sleep wisdom wasn't taught. It was absorbed, like warmth from the fire. And it lived in the bones just as much as in the mind. There's something humbling about the idea that rest could be taught, shaped, cultivated over generations. Today, sleep is often treated like a problem to fix, a symptom of a stressful life, or an inconvenience in a busy schedule. But to our ancestors, rest was a craft, a skill to be honed, protected. The fire had to be built right, the bedding arranged in a certain way. No food too late, no loud talk after nightfall. The cave was a space of ritualized quiet once the darkness settled. Even laughter had a softness to it after sunset, a kind of sacred restraint. Not because of superstition, necessarily, but because people knew instinctively that stillness kept the group calm, that quiet let the nervous system fall into rhythm, that peace was something you created. And what of fear? The dark, the unknown, the predators outside. Yes, fear was real, but it wasn't paralyzing. It was built into the design of the night. The fire's glow didn't reach the cave's entrance for nothing. Someone always slept closest to the path leading out. Usually a younger adult, or someone used to waking quickly. There was no alarm system. There was awareness, practiced and embedded. The knowledge that the group had your back, and this communal trust allowed others, especially children and elders, to sleep more deeply. In modern psychological terms, this is distributed vigilance. The idea that if responsibility is shared across a group, individuals can let down their guard. Early humans didn't eliminate danger. They diluted it through structure, ritual, and attention. The deeper the winter, the more profound the structure became. When storms raged, or the temperature dropped so far the breath froze in your nostrils, the shelter became not just physical, but emotional, a collective hearth for resilience. People would stay closer to home, limiting exposure to the world outside. That meant more sleep, yes, but also more time with one another. A level of nightly intimacy modern life rarely offers. Skin against skin, breath synchronized, heartbeats felt through fur. That closeness wasn't a burden, it was bonding. It reaffirmed belonging. And belonging above all else is what made rest possible. In that time, in that world, sleep wasn't only the absence of wakefulness, it was proof that you were part of something. A group that would wake if you needed them, that would warm you if you turned cold, that would remember you in the morning. We often forget that the body is a record keeper. It remembers what safety feels like. It knows in the deepest parts of its design what it means to sleep well. Not alone, not distracted, but held by rhythm and ritual and warmth. Our ancestors didn't just stumble into good sleep, They created it. They earned it with structure and patience and trust. And when they closed their eyes in the freezing dark, it wasn't in fear, but in faith. Faith in each other, in the fire, in the wisdom passed from generation to generation, like the embers that burned low but steady through the longest night. There's something deeply animal about the way our ancestors moved through winter. Not in the sense of savagery, but in the sense of wisdom. A raw, inherited intuition that many animals still live by, like wolves curled in dens, or deer bedding in thickets. Early humans knew when to withdraw, when to be still. They watched the land, the sky, the changes in animal behavior. They saw how the sun barely lifted above the trees in midwinter, how birds disappeared or changed their calls, how ice crept back over water they once drank from freely. These weren't warnings. They were instructions. The natural world was showing them how to behave, not to fight the cold, but to fold into it. And every night, as they closed their eyes under furs and firelight, they were following the same instinctive code that governed the rest of the living world. Conserve, restore, sleep deeply. The cold didn't just shape behavior, it shaped sensation. Modern studies on cold exposure show that the human body becomes hypersensitive to touch and sound in freezing environments. A brush of fur on the cheek feels sharper. A soft breath beside your ear becomes more vivid. This heightening of the senses likely made sleep more textured, more aware, not necessarily lighter, but more immersive. It's possible that in the deep night, people didn't sink into total unconsciousness, but drifted in and out of a sensory-rich half-sleep, especially those responsible for keeping the fire alive, or listening for distant sounds. This wasn't anxious sleep. It was layered, restful, but ready, like a fox with ears twitching in the snow, still and calm, yet alert to the subtle rhythm of the night. And what dreams must have come in such a space? Without light pollution, without constant noise, without overstimulation. The mind of early humans had room to breathe. Dreams could stretch out long and strange, uninterrupted by alarms or sudden jolts. We know that REM sleep, the stage of vivid dreaming, tends to increase during the second half of the night. In a Paleolithic winter, with its long hours of darkness, the second sleep likely became a space of powerful dreaming. What they dreamed, we'll never fully know. But it's not hard to imagine that animals featured prominently. Reindeer, lions, wolves, mammoths, symbols, stories, echoes of the day folded into myth. Dreams may have been seen not as fantasy, but as knowledge. A dream of ice cracking might be taken as a sign to avoid a nearby lake. A vision of a bison herd might guide the next day's scouting. Sleep and survival were not separate. They were entangled. The textures of sleep itself, the bedding, the skins, the fire-warmed air, were carefully curated in ways we often overlook. In colder climates, reindeer hides were particularly prized. Their hollow fur traps heat exceptionally well. Better even than many modern synthetics, people didn't just throw skins over themselves. They arranged them, layered them, sometimes even stitched them into wraparound garments that could double as bedding. Beneath the body, layers of pine needles or moss, carefully dried, offered a cushion. In some regions, platforms were built from tightly packed reeds or woven branches. The spaces between the slats allowed body heat to rise, while minimizing the cold drawn from the earth. Each of these details was learned by watching, by trying, by remembering, and every material had meaning. The hide from a successful hunt wasn't just food. It became warmth. It became sleep. There's something beautiful about how nothing was wasted. Ash from the fire was used to repel insects or soften bedding. Charred wood lined certain sections of shelter floors, creating thermal barriers. Stones heated by fire were sometimes buried under bedding layers, radiating warmth through the night. Even the soot-blackened walls of a well-used cave told a story of generations tending the same flame, sleeping in the same curve of stone, dreaming under the same constellations. These layers of use created emotional landmarks. A child might lie in the exact spot her grandmother once did, warmed by the same traditions, the same practices. Sleep wasn't just physical, it was ancestral. a continuation of pattern, a link in a chain that stretched far beyond a single lifetime. And so when we think about how cavemen slept through freezing winters, it's not just about temperature. It's about the world they built inside the cold. A world of warmth, sensation, closeness, and memory. They didn't merely survive, they adapted with grace, intention, and surprising sophistication. The winter didn't defeat them. It taught them. It shaped a kind of sleep we've nearly forgotten. Long, deep, trusting, shared, and in those long nights, as snow whispered outside, and firelight flickered on stone, they didn't just rest, they belonged to each other, to the land, to the rhythms that cradled their sleep and guided their dreams. As the dark months rolled on, sleep became more than routine. It became a form of emotional endurance. The deep winter could last for weeks, or even months. With daylight reduced to brief slivers of gray, food stores ran low. Storms might trap a group indoors for days at a time. And in those moments, rest wasn't just a physical act, it was a psychological necessity. In modern times, we speak of seasonal depression, of the heaviness that can come with too much darkness, but our ancestors understood this weight in their own way. They didn't fight it with distraction. They leaned into stillness. And sleep was their vessel. Longer rest wasn't laziness. It was wisdom. A way to let the body and mind survive the emotional toll of cold, hunger, and stillness. Wrapped in furs and firelight, they let their brains drift. Dreams filled the spaces where movement could not. The emotional atmosphere of winter sleep was complex. Within those close quarters, people grieved, laughed, whispered, and simply existed together in ways we rarely do today. They witnessed each other's quiet breakdowns, the slow fading of an elder, the silent grief of a mother who'd lost a child. These events didn't happen behind closed doors or out of sight. They happened in the very center of the sleeping space. They were held in silence, supported by the warmth of shared presence, a hand resting on another's shoulder through the night, a body shifting just enough to make room. In this way, sleep was not escape, it was accompaniment, a way to be present even in suffering. In those dark hours, love and grief lay side by side, woven into the furs, felt in every breath. Even death itself had a place in that world. There are burial sites found inside or near sleeping areas. Not marked tombs, but resting places close to the group. In places like Sangor or La Chapelle aux Saints, archaeologists have uncovered burials with care. Bodies wrapped in ochre, laid to rest with beads, tools or bones. These were not anonymous ends. These were farewells made with love and ritual. It's possible that the dead remained among the living for a time, lying near the fire in the space where they once slept, honored through whispered stories or gentle songs before finally being buried. That relationship with the dead wasn't separate, it was integrated. The line between sleep and death, between dream and memory, blurred in the winter dark. And for the living, rest became a form of reverence, a way to carry those who no longer stirred. Still, protection remained a constant, even in the emotional intimacy of the group. Vigilance didn't vanish. The way a mother instinctively wakes at a baby's smallest cry, that was the way whole families functioned. The snap of a branch outside, the shift of the wind through the cave mouth. These sounds mattered. Someone would stir. Sometimes no words were spoken, just a shared glance in the flickering dark, or the soft scrape of a spear being drawn closer. And then, quiet again. These weren't constant terrors. They were calibrated alerts. The body knew what to listen for, and because the group held that awareness collectively, it allowed everyone else to sink back into rest more quickly. Trust was always present, even when no one was speaking. It was felt in the stillness that followed, in the fire being stirred gently back to life. This balance of vulnerability and security, of openness and protection, created a kind of emotional resilience that modern life rarely allows. Today, many people sleep alone, in locked rooms, surrounded by artificial sound and light. And still, they struggle to rest. Our ancestors slept under the threat of wild predators, freezing cold, and sickness, and yet they may have slept more deeply. Not because they were tougher, but because they had what we've largely lost: proximity, human contact, rhythmic, real sound, a pace of life that matched the world outside. And perhaps most importantly, the permission to sleep when their bodies asked them to, even if that meant sleeping 14 hours a night, or drifting in and out of slumber throughout a storm-filled day. They weren't trying to win the day. They were trying to make it through the season. And sleep was the most powerful tool they had. So when we look back at those nights, thick with silence, softened by fur, warmed by flame, we see a world that feels ancient and distant, yet familiar in some deep place we can't quite name: the rituals, the placement of bodies, the shared breath, the grieving and the dreaming. These are things we still understand, even if we've buried them beneath schedules and screens. The cold may have ruled outside, but inside there was a world of connection and quiet resistance, a world built every night, in darkness and firelight, where people found the courage not to fight the season, but to rest within it. We like to think we've evolved past the old ways, that central heating, LED bulbs, and memory foam have freed us from the rawness of winter sleep. But our biology tells another story. Inside us still lives the rhythm of the fire, the trust of the circle, the sensitivity to light, cold and quiet. The brain still floods with melatonin when darkness falls, even if we drown it in screen glow. The skin still craves touch in the cold. The nervous system still calms in response to real silence. These aren't remnants, they're active, working parts of us. Which means that while the world has changed, we haven't entirely lost the instincts that once guided our ancestors to sleep. They're just quieter now, harder to hear. But they're there, waiting to be remembered. You can feel it when you sleep beside someone, and match their breath without meaning to. When you camp outside, and wake not to an alarm, but to the change in birdsong. When you step into a cold room, and instinctively curl your limbs toward your chest. These are echoes, movements carried forward from a time when every signal mattered. Our ancestors didn't sleep with apps or schedules. But their rest wasn't less sophisticated. It was more in tune, and in winter, especially, that tuning became the difference between endurance and collapse. A group that rested well could move faster, think clearer, stay warmer. A group that didn't might not survive the season. So they watched, they adjusted, they listened to the wind, to the dark, to the way their own bodies responded to the cave around them, and they crafted their space accordingly. Some prehistoric shelters show signs of seasonal rearrangement. Bedding moved deeper into the cave for colder months. Fire pits rebuilt with wider stones to hold heat longer. Tools placed in easy reach for nighttime defense or comfort. In some dwellings, deer antlers were arranged along the walls, not for decoration, but possibly as hooks for gear or drying skins. A practical form of organization that kept sleeping spaces clear and functional. The point is, nothing was static. Sleep space evolved with the season. It breathed, just like the people inside it. And that flexibility, that refusal to impose a rigid routine, is something we still long for today. A room that changes with us, rather than one we try to bend ourselves around. The sounds of winter sleep were shaped as much by absence as by presence. There was no hum of electronics, no distant highway. Instead, sound was elemental. Fire, footsteps in snow, the distant boom of ice cracking over a river. In this soundscape, humans didn't need to drown out noise. They responded to it. A rustle outside might mean an animal, or just wind. Either way, the body learned what mattered, and perhaps just as importantly, what didn't. Sleep wasn't fragile, it was practiced, the same way a hunter learns to hear the difference between branches and hooves. A sleeper in the Ice Age learned to let the fire crackle without waking, to let breath and heartbeat form the soundtrack of night. It's this selective attunement that allowed deep rest, even in environments we'd call wild. Smell played a role, just as profound. Long before synthetic detergents or perfumes, the smell of the sleeping space was familiar and full. Wood smoke, tanned hide, damp earth, dried herbs, animal fat, and ash. These smells weren't just tolerated, they were woven into the memory of home. And in that way, smell became an emotional anchor. Even today, certain scents can trigger powerful memories, calming the body instantly. For Paleolithic people, the return to the same bed of reeds and firs, warmed by the same family beside the same fire, would have created a deep association of safety. No wonder they could rest so fully. Every sense confirmed it was time to let go. And maybe that's the greatest lesson they offer us. Sleep wasn't a pause in their life. It was a continuation of it. They didn't treat sleep as a problem to solve or a prize to earn. It was built into the way they lived, just as essential as food, fire, or shelter. In winter especially, it was the glue that held the group together. Night after night, breath after breath, and while we may no longer lie in fur-wrapped circles beneath painted cave ceilings, the part of us that once did is still there. Still breathing, still listening for the wind, still remembering how to rest in the cold. Time for our ancestors was not measured by clocks or minutes, but by sensation. In the depth of winter, it slowed to something ancient, the length of a fire's life, the silence between winds, the arc of the moon across the frozen sky. Night itself wasn't a singular thing. It arrived in waves. Dusk was its first breath, a gentle dimming, a softening of colors on stone and fur. Then full night came, pressing against the walls of the cave, thick and total, until even the glowing embers barely carved out shapes in the dark. And later, in the deep hours, a kind of sacred silence settled in, the soundless moment, when even the fire paused, and the world held its breath. In that stillness, early humans let go of waking life. Their sense of time gave way to rhythm, and in that rhythm they found sleep. Without light bulbs, or television, or alarms, the brain could fully yield to the natural cues of the environment, the gradual cooling of the air, the whisper of animal sounds, shifting from active to still, the collective softening of voices around the hearth. These cues told the body what to do. Sleep wasn't something they planned. It came through them, like a tide through reeds. And when it arrived, they met it fully, not in isolated beds with white noise and blackout curtains, but surrounded by warmth, woven into the group, lulled by the sounds and smells of life. It's possible that the release of sleep hormones, melatonin, oxytocin, serotonin, was even stronger in this communal, natural setting. Everything was aligned. There was no fight to fall asleep. There was only surrender. In that surrender came something else, imagination. When the outside world was locked in ice and dark, the mind turned inward, and in sleep it found new places to roam. Dreams weren't shallow distractions. They were immersive landscapes. For people without written language, dreams were often the deepest form of narrative they experienced. The stories they remembered in the morning might become tales told by the fire, or omens, or signs. Sometimes, it was in sleep that ancestors appeared, faces from the past, known only through stories, walking through a snowy forest, or pointing toward a distant ridge. These visions, formed in the quiet cave, held weight. They gave meaning to the long nights. And when everyone woke together, blinking in the fire's glow, those dreams became part of the shared story of the group. The winter cave was a place of sensory depth. Touch was amplified. Every shift of fur, every press of another body's warmth. Sight was limited, but the low flicker of flame painted moving shadows across rough stone. Sound was never absent, the rhythmic breathing of sleep, the occasional pop of sap and firewood, the sigh of someone turning over. Even taste had a role. The residue of smoked meat on the tongue, the cooling bitterness of herbal drinks made from dried roots or bark. These layers of experience formed a textured, grounded world, in which rest became not just possible, but inevitable. The body could let go, because the environment asked nothing of it. No decisions, no notifications, no demands, just stillness, warmth, and darkness. And yet, despite all this quiet, the mind didn't idle. It processed, wove, remembered. Today we know that REM sleep plays a crucial role in memory consolidation and emotional processing. The same would have been true then. Each night of deep sleep helped early humans not only survive physically, but maintain emotional clarity, reinforce social bonds, and plan ahead. It may sound odd, but winter sleep helped them stay human, to hold on to what they had learned, to prepare for what would come, to remember who they were. In that frozen world, memory and identity were fragile. Sleep kept them whole. In many ways, it was the furnace inside the furnace, a hidden fire, rebuilding them in the dark. This is the paradox of winter sleep in the Ice Age, that it was both still and alive. That while the world outside was locked in silence and frost, the world inside the cave, inside the mind was moving, pulsing, dreaming. Our ancestors didn't sleep like we do, because they couldn't. Their world didn't allow for distraction. It allowed for presence. And in that presence, they built a kind of rest that was deeper, more integrated, and more complete than most of us know today. Not by striving for it, but by living in tune with the night. There was a turning point. Each year, subtle and slow, when the long grip of winter began to loosen. It wasn't a warm breeze or a sudden thaw, not yet. It was the light. Just a little more of it each day, seeping into the cave a few heartbeats earlier than before, the first golden thread across the cave floor in the morning. The way shadows shifted, and somehow everyone noticed. Not with words necessarily, but with breath, posture, tone. The body knew the change was beginning, and with that shift came a new kind of sleep. Slightly shorter, a touch lighter. The slow drift into spring wasn't just an environmental event. It was biological. Circadian rhythms adjusted, naturally, quietly, without resistance. The body didn't fight the change. It followed it. It trusted the sky. That trust had been earned. Through countless winters, humans had learned that nothing stayed frozen forever. The darkness would recede. The snow would melt. Food would return. And so, during winter's most oppressive stretch, they didn't panic. They paced themselves. They built entire lives around waiting well. Patience was part of the culture, taught like any other skill, and sleep was the heart of it. If you could rest deeply and often, you could last. You didn't waste energy on fear. You stored it. You used sleep as a kind of invisible strategy to preserve the body, to soothe the mind, to carry you closer to the light. Some researchers believe that Paleolithic people may have marked these seasonal transitions through ritual sleep, staying awake for long communal nights around the fire, near solstice time, then sleeping deeply for days afterward. This mirrors traditions seen in early agricultural societies that later emerged. Festivals of darkness and light, vigils followed by feasts, sacred rest after sacred wakefulness. In the Ice Age, these patterns may have already been forming. Instinctive responses to the most ancient drama humans witnessed, the return of the sun. Some caves contain markings that align with solstice light, shafts that catch the sunrise, or illuminate carvings only once per year. For a people who lived so closely with sleep, light may have been more than warmth. It may have been meaning, proof that the night always ends, but until that light returned fully, winter sleep remained central, and with it came a kind of clarity. Not the sharpness of action, but the clarity of stillness. The way snow muffles the landscape, until only the essential sounds remain. In those months of darkness, life was stripped down to fire, to breath, to heartbeat, to the slow curl of smoke along the cave ceiling. And in that simplicity, people became attuned to each other in ways we can only guess at. The shifting of a blanket, the murmur of a dream, the lean of one body toward another. These weren't distractions. They were the life itself, a kind of communal awareness that lived and breathed alongside the fire. It's tempting to romanticize it, to imagine those nights as idyllic. But there were hard ones too. Nights when the cold bit too deep, when someone coughed through the dark, when hunger made sleep thin. But even then, sleep offered something no other act could: recovery. Not just of strength, but of hope. Every morning someone woke, stirred the embers, stepped out into the frost, looked up at the same sky their ancestors had watched for centuries, and then went back in to tell the others. With a look or a wordless gesture, whether the light had changed, whether it was time to start moving again. Sleep made those mornings possible. It was the bridge across the hardest nights. And so winter sleep wasn't static. It evolved. As the season deepened, rest deepened with it. As the light returned, sleep shifted again. A slow rise back toward wakefulness. This dance between dark and light wasn't something they fought. It was something they moved with. And in that movement, year after year, generation after generation, they learned to survive the season, not by resisting it, but by surrendering to it. Not through struggle, but through rest. That is what winter taught them. That sleep, when shaped with care and shared in warmth, was not a weakness. It was a quiet form of strength, in the slow, quiet dark of winter. Early humans learned the art of adjustment. Not grand changes, but the smallest tweaks. The way a fur was shifted, the stone propping a firewood stack, adjusted just slightly. The sleeping space realigned by inches to block a cold draft. These weren't dramatic moments. They were practiced, almost invisible decisions passed silently between members of the group, and over time, those small adjustments built a world within a world. A shelter inside the larger cold, shaped by knowledge not written but remembered in bone and breath. In that way the sleeping space itself became alive, always changing slightly with the wind, the mood, the season, the needs of those within it. The winter cave wasn't static. It breathed with the people who used it. There's evidence in archaeological layers. Tiny piles of ash, stone hearth circles, built on old ones, pressed down plant matter that shows constant reshaping, that supports this kind of slow living design. Some nights, they may have slept closer together. Other nights, spread slightly apart. Sometimes the fire was made small and hot to conserve fuel. Other times, larger, when warmth was needed for healing or illness. These were not rules. They were responsive, and every person in that space, young or old, became fluent in this unspoken language of winter sleep. It wasn't a system anyone invented. It was one they stepped into, season after season, as naturally as a migrating bird flies south. And within that rhythm, sleep itself became a kind of ritual. Not with incense or chants, but with quiet repetition. The same sequence of actions at night. Lay out the hides, check the fire, tuck in the children, whisper a story, adjust the firewood one more time, listen for the wind outside. And only then, lie down, curl into warmth, close the eyes. These habits, repeated thousands of times across lifetimes, became more than survival techniques. They were the emotional anchors of winter. In a world without calendars or clocks, they gave the night its shape. And for the body, always listening, always feeling. Those patterns were the signal that it was safe to let go, that it was time to drift into the long, slow dark. It's important to remember how sensory-rich those sleeping environments were. The glow of fire on stone, flickering shadows moving like cave spirits, the low, almost inaudible breath of someone next to you, the dry scent of pine needles under your back, the far-off sound of a winter owl calling through the snow-laden trees. These weren't luxuries, they were constants, and because they changed so little from night to night, they helped the mind stay calm. Today, people buy machines to replicate these patterns. Firelight lamps, white noise machines, grounding blankets. But in the Ice Age, all of it was simply there, integrated into life. The cave was the body's sleep sanctuary, and its cues were perfectly aligned with human biology. And while there was little spoken instruction around it, children learned everything by being in the middle of it. They knew which hide was softest, which corner was warmer, which creak of wind meant a draft would soon come. They saw how adults rearranged things after someone fell ill, how grandmothers placed sacred objects near sleeping infants, bones, carved stones or pouches of dried herbs. Not as superstition, but as comfort. In some ways the children were always learning the language of the cave. Not with words, but with experience. And in the repetition of that experience, they built an internal map of rest, a sensory memory that would stay with them, echoing later as adults when they began to guide the next generation into the same rhythms. It's difficult to overstate the emotional safety that came from these shared spaces. Not because there was no danger, but because danger was expected and accounted for. The world outside could not always be controlled, but inside, within the bounds of firelight and warmth, they created something sacred, a place where the night wasn't feared. It was met, under fur and stone and shared breath. They didn't sleep with dread, but with acceptance, and that quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your group will hold you through the night. Maybe one of the oldest forms of peace humans have ever known. Sometimes the world outside didn't just whisper winter, it screamed it. The wind wouldn't simply blow, it would howl like an ancient voice, trying to split the earth open. Temperatures would drop so far that the breath from a nostril froze before it was fully exhaled. Snowdrifts swallowed the paths to water sources. Predators became bolder, leaner, hungrier. These were the nights when movement stopped entirely, when the shelter became a sealed world. In these moments, early humans didn't resist the stillness. They deepened it. The fires burned lower, more carefully. Words were few. Sleep came earlier and stayed longer. There was no incentive to stir when the storm pressed against the stone. Instead, they stayed close, conserving not just body heat, but mental energy. And when the storm passed, when the first ray of pale sun touched the cave floor again, they emerged rested, not broken. That was the gift of sleep, in its most primal form, a shield against collapse. In these deepest parts of winter, the brain and body shifted into healing modes. Wounds knit faster in deep sleep. Emotional shocks softened, even hunger pangs dulled in longer periods of rest. This wasn't accidental. Modern science tells us that deep non-REM sleep is essential for tissue repair, hormone regulation, immune function, and emotional processing. Without medication, without supplements, early humans tapped into all of it, simply by sleeping more when the body asked for it. The stillness wasn't wasted time. It was repair, and when the world outside became too harsh, they turned inward, physically and psychologically, allowing themselves to fall into the kind of long, layered sleep that gave them the power to go on once conditions allowed it. That act alone, trusting rest in the face of hardship, is revolutionary. We are trained today to respond to threat with effort, push harder, stay busy, distract. But our ancestors knew something we've forgotten. Sometimes the only way through is to pause, to gather under blankets, under breath, under the warm hush of fur and ash, and simply be. There's a strength in that kind of surrender. Not weakness, but understanding. That winter wasn't an enemy, it was a cycle, and sleep was how they flowed with it, rather than breaking against it. So they let themselves rest through the worst of it, knowing that when the time came to hunt again, to travel, to face what waited outside, they'd be ready, because they'd given themselves the time to recover. This recovery wasn't just individual, it was cultural. The stories passed during winter nights were more than entertainment. They reinforced identity, who we are, where we came from, what it means to survive together. A child might fall asleep midway through a tale about the first mammoth their people ever hunted, or the way the stars came into being. Those dreams would mix with the rhythm of the story, settling in the mind like a seed. In that sleep, culture rooted itself, memory became layered, and so rest became not only biological healing, but mythic reinforcement. They weren't just sleeping to recharge, they were sleeping to remember who they were. That's why winter sleep had texture. It wasn't empty hours, it was filled with breath, with firelight, with voices that blurred into dreams. It was punctuated by the stirrings of someone checking the fire, by the sigh of a child pressed tighter against a parent's side, by the occasional snore or murmur of a name spoken in sleep. These sounds weren't noise, they were reassurance, proof that the group was whole, alive here. Sleep in that space wasn't isolation. It was participation. You were part of something larger, something living, something warm in the coldest world. And in that participation, people gained strength, not just for the morning, but for the next season of life. What they carried forward wasn't just warmth and health. It was clarity, belonging, and resilience. Winter was not an interruption to life. It was a space carved out for deep return. To the body, to the group, to memory. And sleep was the doorway that opened to all of it. Not as luxury, not even as necessity, but as a fundamental form of being. In that fire-warmed dark, the deepest truths were not spoken, they were slept into being. As each winter gave way to another, year after year, a kind of generational rhythm took shape. The children who once fell asleep beside glowing embers became the ones tending the fire. The arms that were held for warmth grew strong enough to hold others. Sleep was not just rest, it was instruction. A cycle that imprinted itself into the nervous system of each new generation. There were no written records, no scripts passed down. The inheritance lived in gesture, posture, and pattern, in the way someone smoothed a hide over a child, in the way someone placed a bone near the fire, not for fuel, but to dry for later use. The cave was a school, and sleep was one of its oldest lessons. Its curriculum was silence, warmth, patience, and awareness, and everyone who lay within it, night after night, learned without ever being formally taught. In that world, the body wasn't separated from its environment. It was calibrated to it. The way light crept into the cave in late morning was felt on the skin before it was registered by the eye. The way the cave floor cooled through the night taught people how to build better bedding, how to shift without disturbing those around them. Over time, those who listened closely to these details thrived, and the culture itself was shaped by that listening. Slow, observant, sensory. Rest wasn't about inactivity. It was about tuning, listening inward and outward, until both signals matched. And when they did, the body slept as it was meant to, easily, fully, and in rhythm with the breath of the land itself. This kind of harmony isn't something you can manufacture with gadgets or routines. It's something you live into, day by day, night by night, until it becomes who you are. The hunter who knew which rock to rest near after tracking prey for hours also knew how to choose a place to sleep. The mother who lulled a baby with a hum. She learned from her mother's mother, didn't think about technique. She lived it. The rhythms were passed without ceremony, but with total intimacy. That's how winter rest became a cultural memory. Not a practice, but a presence. And like all presence, it needed consistency. And the long dark season provided it in abundance. Modern life has fractured that consistency. We now live apart, separated by walls, devices, commutes, clocks. We sleep alone. We silence our bodies rather than listen to them, and still in the quietest moments, something in us reaches back toward the firelight, toward the warmth, toward the memory of shared sleep. It might happen when a storm knocks out the power, when we camp far from cell towers, when we curl up under too many blankets in winter, and feel for just a moment something older settling in our bones. That's the legacy calling back, not in words but in feeling. The body knows what the mind has forgotten, that sleep used to be the place where we came together, not apart, where the fire wasn't just warmth, but signal, where the night wasn't interruption, but ritual. There's something powerful in knowing that rest was once this sacred, that it was shaped not by convenience, but by care, that it meant something beyond health. It meant home. To sleep in a winter cave, close to the heart of your people, was to accept your place in the lineage, to become one with the quiet pulse of survival that stretched back through time. Each night, as sleep returned, so did that pulse. You joined it without thinking, because it was never gone. It waited for you, in the crackle of fire, the hush of snow, the softness of fur beneath your cheek. That pulse is still here. It may beat more quietly now, but it's never stopped. So when we think about those long nights tens of thousands of years ago, we are not looking at strangers. We're looking at ourselves, just closer to the source. People who didn't need to fight their rest or chase it. People who knew when the body asked for stillness and knew how to offer it fully. Their wisdom lives in our breath, in our longing for silence, in our craving for warmth. And their greatest ritual, the nightly return to sleep, even in the harshest cold, is a reminder that sometimes the most radical thing we can do is listen, curl inward, and rest. Some nights, the cold would come so sharply, it would wake you before the fire needed tending. A draft, a shift in the air, the quiet crunch of snow outside the cave mouth. And without opening your eyes, you'd know something had changed. One person would stir, wrap another hide across the feet of a sleeping child. Maybe slide a hot stone closer. No words, just the gentle rhythm of care, shaped by countless nights before, then stillness again. Sleep didn't break, it flexed, adjusted. It was never a rigid wall between night and day. It was a tide, ebbing and flowing through the silence, wrapping itself around fire and breath and time. In those moments, even half awake, a person was part of something larger, a centuries-old choreography of protection and patience. And that's the part modern eyes often miss. This wasn't primitive life, it was precision, carried in the quiet. Our ancestors didn't just lie down and hope for the best. They shaped their nights with instinct, observation, and trust. The fire's placement, the bedding layers, the smell of the air before a storm, the tone of a baby's cry at midnight. These were signals, and they knew how to read them. And more than that, they responded to them together. Rest was never a solitary experience. Every night, the group wove itself into a pattern. Bodies curled into each other like a single organism, each member adjusting their role without fanfare. And through that slow shared responsiveness, everyone found space to sleep, not in spite of the world outside, but because of the world they created inside. That world, warm and flickering, was held together by one invisible thread, rhythm. Everything pulsed in rhythm. The fire, the breath, the stories, the dream cycles. When someone rose to add wood to the coals, it was part of the rhythm. When a mother woke and reached for her child, it was rhythm. The mind, even in sleep, responded to it. And just like a heartbeat, it wasn't always even. Some nights were restless, some deep, but through it all, the rhythm remained, carried by the structure of night and the quiet discipline of care. In this way, sleep was more than rest. It was the music the whole group moved to, even as they lay silent in the dark. And what they gained from that music was more than just recovery. It was resilience. In a time when every day could bring danger, from predators, starvation, injury, or freezing, the ability to face the morning rested on how well the night had gone. A well-rested group could walk farther, hunt better, think clearer. They weren't groggy or depleted. They were restored. Their minds had sorted through memories. Their bodies had mended. Their emotions had settled. All through sleep. And while we tend to think of survival as teeth and tools and fire, our ancestors knew better. The truest survival tool was restoration, not just physically, but emotionally. Winter wasn't just endured. It was absorbed, softened by sleep. Even the stories told at dusk were crafted to prepare the mind for that softness. Long, slow tales with rhythm and repetition. Myths told in half whispers as eyes began to close. Children who fell asleep before the end would wake in the morning and ask how it finished, only to be told, "We'll begin again tonight." There was no urgency to complete it, no pressure to reach the point. The story was the night stretched out, flickering in the firelight, changing slightly with each telling. These weren't just ways to pass time. They were transitions. They marked the movement from waking into dreaming. And in that movement, there was no division. You drifted from one world into another, with no line between them. So when the fire burned low, and the breath of the group grew deep and even, what remained was not silence, but presence. A kind of collective hum that lived under the skins and stone. Not noise, but a frequency of calm. And in that calm, the body returned to something it always knew. That it was safe, that it was not alone, that it was time, Time to drift. Time to dream. Time to let winter pass, not in fear, but in sleep. It's strange. In a way, the more we learn about the past, the more we discover how little we've truly changed. Thousands of years, empires risen and fallen, inventions beyond imagination, and still the human need for rest remains the same. A warm place to lie down, the quiet breath of someone nearby, the rhythmic hush of night. In every generation since those Ice Age nights, sleep has held us together, and when winter comes with its darkness, its cold, its long stretches of quiet, something ancient still stirs in us. We pull blankets tighter, we sleep more, we eat heavier food, we nest, and somewhere in our bones, the cave is still there, not gone, just buried beneath electric light and restless modern thoughts. That cave, though, wasn't just a place, it was a way of being. A space shaped by rhythm and care, by shared breath and warmth, by rituals repeated so gently they never needed to be spoken aloud. And when you think of it now, the fire, the furs, the silence, you might realize that the past doesn't feel so distant, that even now you carry it, in your longing for quiet, in the calm that comes from a rainy afternoon or a snow-covered street, in the relief you feel when you finally lie down at the end of a long day and let your weight sink into stillness. That's not convenience, that's memory, deep memory. What our ancestors built wasn't just shelter from the cold. It was a philosophy of winter, a relationship with the dark. They didn't rush to escape it. They lived within it. They found ways to soften it. They rested with the season, not in spite of it. And through that rest, they healed. Not just their bodies, but their minds, their relationships, their sense of self. In that nightly surrender to stillness, they became whole again. And they did it without needing to fix anything. They simply allowed themselves to sleep, together, in tune with the land, in a world like ours, noisy, fast, lit up far past sunset. That lesson feels more vital than ever. Maybe we can't go back to the caves. Maybe we don't need to. But we can remember the shape of that rest, the permission it gave, the softness it held. We can slow down when the days grow shorter. We can let go of the pressure to be endlessly productive. We can reclaim the nights as something sacred, not just absence of light, but presence of stillness, because that's what the night has always been. A place to come home to yourself. A place to listen, to recover, to dream. So if you're listening to this now, maybe already deep in rest, or just arriving at its edge, know that you're part of a very old story, a story told in firelight and breath, a story written not in words, but in sleep itself. The story of people who survived the coldest winters, not through noise or panic, but through patience, through rhythm, through each other. And as you breathe out, settling into your own version of that shelter, you're continuing that story, quietly, without effort, just by letting go. Thank you for being here, for walking with me through this long, quiet journey into the winter of our past. If you're still awake, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. Drop a comment, or just carry that question with you into sleep. If this story helped you relax, helped you feel something, feel free to subscribe, so we can travel again together next time. Until then, rest well, sleep deeply. You're safe here.